The dry wind swept across Black River Ranch, rustling the brittle grass under the golden glow of the setting sun. A lone figure stood firm in the open field, gripping a lead rope with steady hands. Thomas Whitaker, an aging yet dignified horseman, had seen his fair share of challenges, but none quite like this. His weathered face, framed by a thick silver beard, remained unreadable as he held onto the reins of the stallion before him. The horse was a majestic thoroughbred, its chestnut coat shimmering in the dimming light, muscles rippling beneath its sleek frame. A distinct white blaze ran down the center of its face, contrasting against its deep, intelligent eyes that burned with defiance. Every inch of the horse screamed power: long, muscular legs built for speed, a broad chest that exuded strength, and a fiery temperament that had made it impossible for anyone to tame. A few yards away, a group of men stood in stiff, formal attire, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright amusement. They were Frank Dawson's men, hardened ranchers who believed in force over finesse. Dawson himself, standing at the center in a fitted vest and hat, smirked as he watched the scene unfold. "Thomas, you're wasting your time. That horse," he gestured at the stallion, which snorted loudly, shifting its weight with barely restrained energy, "has thrown off every top rider I've hired. What makes you think an old man like you can succeed?" The men behind him chuckled, their laughter carrying across the dry plains. But Thomas didn't react. He simply stepped closer to the horse, letting the stallion feel his presence. Storm, as the horse was called, flicked his ears back, tail lashing, nostrils flaring with irritation. The energy in the air was palpable, as if an explosion was inevitable. But Thomas wasn't here to fight the horse. He wasn't here to break him, to force him into submission. He knew thoroughbreds were creatures of pride, intelligence, and raw instinct. They didn't surrender to fear, but they respected trust. Slowly, Thomas lifted a hand and rested it against Storm's powerful neck. The stallion flinched, his muscles tensing like a coiled spring. Every man watching expected the inevitable. Storm would rear up, kick, bolt, throw Thomas to the ground like he had done to every other man. And then, something happened that no one expected. A heavy silence settled over Black River Ranch, the kind that made men uneasy. The group of ranchers stood frozen, their laughter fading into a tense stillness. They had all seen Storm react before, wild, untamed, a beast of raw muscle and fury. He had thrown off the best riders in the state, some left limping away in pain, others too humiliated to return. But now, under the fading glow of the sun, the fiery thoroughbred stood still, his breath coming in sharp, rhythmic exhales, his powerful chest rising and falling beneath his shimmering chestnut coat. The men had expected a violent explosion, hooves lashing out, the stallion rearing high, Thomas being thrown to the ground like the others before him. But instead, something unexplainable was happening. Storm's dark eyes, once filled with distrust, were locked onto Thomas Whitaker, studying him as if trying to decipher the old man's intentions. The horse's muscles quivered, still prepared to resist, but his instincts told him that something was different this time. Thomas sat in the saddle, his worn leather vest shifting slightly as he adjusted his posture. He wasn't forcing the horse into submission. He wasn't yanking the reins, wasn't digging his boots into the stallion's sides. Instead, he simply sat there, allowing Storm to feel his presence, his weight, his energy. The old trainer had spent his entire life around horses, and he knew one thing that Frank Dawson and his men never understood. A horse wasn't broken by fear, it was guided by trust. A deep, throaty snort escaped Storm's nostrils, the sound almost defiant, but not aggressive. His tail flicked sharply, his muscles tensing for a brief moment before relaxing. The men behind Thomas exchanged bewildered glances. How was this possible? How had a man they mocked as too old and outdated accomplished in minutes what others had failed to do in months? Frank Dawson, who had been watching with a smirk just minutes ago, was now gripping the edge of his coat, his jaw tightening. He had placed bets against Thomas, had convinced himself that the old man's time had passed. And yet, there he was, sitting atop the most unruly horse Dawson had ever owned, a horse that should have already thrown him into the dust. Then, Thomas did something that made every man watching hold their breath. With a slow, deliberate movement, he leaned forward and whispered something into the horse's ear. No one could hear what he said, but they all saw what happened next. The moment Thomas leaned forward and whispered into Storm's ear, the tension in the air grew thick enough to choke on. The stallion's ears twitched, his nostrils flared, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though the horse would lunge forward, throwing the old man to the dirt like he had done to so many others. The ranch hands stood motionless, their smirks replaced with furrowed brows and hesitant glances at one another. Even Frank Dawson, who had spent months declaring Storm untamable, was now gripping his vest tightly, his face darkened with disbelief. Storm let out a deep, heavy exhale, his breath hot and loud in the cool evening air. The powerful thoroughbred, built for speed and bred for endurance, shifted his weight, his muscles tightening beneath his flawless chestnut coat. His tail swished once, his hooves scuffing against the dry earth. Then, something changed. His rigid frame softened, his stance no longer one of defiance but of decision. He wasn't surrendering. No, that wasn't in his nature. But he was listening. Thomas didn't move. He didn't rush. He simply allowed the horse to process the moment. He had learned long ago that forcing a creature like this into submission was a fool's errand. Storm had spent months fighting every hand that tried to break him, resisting the harsh methods of men who thought they could conquer him through fear. But Thomas wasn't here to conquer him. He was here to earn his trust. The ranch hands murmured among themselves, confusion evident in their hushed voices. "He should have been thrown by now," one whispered. "No one's lasted this long." Another shook his head, eyes locked onto the scene before them. "I don't get it. What did he say to that damn horse?" Frank Dawson was no longer watching with amusement. His expression had hardened into something closer to frustration. His money, his reputation, everything rested on the belief that this horse was untamable. If Thomas succeeded, Dawson wouldn't just be proven wrong, he would be humiliated. Clenching his jaw, he took a step forward and barked, "Enough of this nonsense. If that horse won't throw him, make him move. Let's see if he actually has control." A nervous energy passed through the crowd as all eyes fell back on Thomas and Storm. The challenge had been set. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Without a word, Thomas took a deep breath, gave the lightest squeeze of his knees against Storm's sides, and waited for fate to decide what would happen next. The world seemed to hold its breath as Thomas Whitaker gave the slightest pressure with his knees against Storm's sides. The stallion's ears flicked back, his nostrils flared, and for a moment it felt as though the entire ranch stood on the edge of something impossible. Every man watching expected chaos, a violent buck, a furious charge, something that would shatter the illusion that Thomas had any real control over the beast. But then, Storm moved. Not in an explosion of defiance, not in a wild frenzy, but in a smooth, deliberate step forward. His muscles rippled beneath his gleaming chestnut coat, his hooves pressing into the dry earth with measured confidence. A murmur swept through the ranch hands like wildfire, disbelief flickering in their wide eyes. This was the horse that had thrown everyone. This was the animal that Dawson had called a lost cause. And yet, he was now walking calmly beneath a man they had all dismissed as too old, too broken. Frank Dawson's face twisted into something ugly. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. He had bet against Thomas. He had mocked him, made a spectacle of this moment, and now, before his very eyes, his carefully constructed certainty was falling apart. His men were watching, and worse, they were starting to believe in what they were seeing. That was something Dawson couldn't afford. Storm took another step, then another. His breathing was steady now, his tail swishing lazily behind him. The fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed, but it was no longer the wild, uncontrollable rage that had defined him before. It was something else now. A test, a conversation, a silent agreement between man and beast. Thomas never forced. He never commanded. He simply guided, and Storm, for the first time, was willing to listen. One of Dawson's men broke the silence first. "I don't believe it," he muttered, shaking his head. Another scoffed, though there was no real conviction behind it. "That ain't possible. No man has lasted more than 5 seconds on that horse." And yet, Thomas remained, his posture firm yet at ease, his hands steady on the reins but never harsh. The impossible had happened. Dawson had seen enough. He stepped forward, his voice like gravel. "All right, old man. You got him walking. But that don't prove nothing. Let's see if you can run him." The words dripped with something venomous, a challenge, a dare, and maybe even a little desperation. The tension in the air thickened once again. Thomas didn't reply. He simply exhaled, gave Storm the lightest cue, and waited to see if trust could truly conquer fire. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made men sweat even in the cool evening breeze. Every pair of eyes was locked on Thomas Whitaker and the fiery thoroughbred beneath him. The world seemed to shrink down to this single moment, where nothing else existed except the unspoken challenge between man, beast, and the doubters who stood waiting for failure. Frank Dawson's voice still lingered in the air, sharp, taunting. "Let's see if you can run him." For a split second, Storm remained still, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he processed the command. Running was different from walking. Running meant surrendering control, meant trusting the rider on his back to guide him, not dominate him. And for a horse like Storm, who had known only resistance and punishment, trust was a dangerous thing. Would he listen? Or would he explode, as Dawson so desperately hoped? Thomas could feel the stallion's powerful muscles tensing beneath him, like coiled springs waiting to snap. His hands remained steady on the reins, not pulling, not demanding, just offering guidance. He exhaled, a slow, patient breath, and gave Storm the lightest squeeze with his legs. No force, no fear, just an invitation. And then it happened. Storm surged forward. But it wasn't the frantic, uncontrolled burst of speed the men had expected. It wasn't a desperate attempt to throw Thomas off. It was power, pure and precise. The thoroughbred's hooves struck the earth in rhythmic thunder, his long, muscular legs stretching into the perfect stride. His chestnut coat gleamed under the last light of the setting sun, and his tail streamed behind him like a banner of victory. He wasn't running away, he was running with Thomas. The ranch hands were silent, their disbelief frozen on their faces. They had seen Storm buck, kick, rage against every rider before. But this was something different. Something they couldn't explain. Frank Dawson's expression was unreadable. But his clenched jaw and the way his hands twitched at his sides told the truth. He had lost control of the moment. The horse he had labeled untamable was now running, not because he had been broken, but because he had been understood. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his voice barely a whisper in the wind. "That's it, boy. Let's show 'em what you can really do." And with that, Storm stretched his stride even further, not just running, but flying. The pounding of Storm's hooves echoed across the open field, each powerful stride kicking up dust and shaking the very foundation of Black River Ranch. The chestnut stallion stretched his long, muscular legs with precision, his movements fluid, effortless, the embodiment of raw speed and control. The last remnants of sunlight cast a golden glow over his gleaming coat, making him look almost untouchable, like a force of nature finally unleashed. Thomas Whitaker leaned forward in the saddle, feeling the rhythmic surge of power beneath him. He had ridden great horses in his lifetime, but none like this one. There was no hesitation in Storm's stride, no hint of rebellion, only the sheer joy of movement, of running for the sake of it, Not because he was forced, but because he had chosen to trust the man riding him. Thomas could feel it in every fiber of his being. This was no longer a battle. This was a partnership. Behind them, the group of ranch hands stood frozen, their faces washed in disbelief. Silence gripped the men who had once laughed at the idea of an old man taming the untamable. They had expected failure. They had waited for the moment Storm would snap, that inevitable instant when Thomas would be thrown into the dirt like all the others. But that moment never came. Instead, they were witnessing something they could barely comprehend: a wild stallion, once feared and dismissed, running freely with a man who was supposed to be past his prime. Frank Dawson clenched his fists at his sides, his face dark with frustration. His grip on the ranch, on the respect of his men, was slipping through his fingers. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. This was about control. About proving that force and dominance were the only way to command respect. But what was unfolding in front of him? A man who had been mocked for his outdated ways was proving him wrong in the most undeniable way possible. Storm's breathing was steady, powerful, in sync with the wind that howled across the plains. Thomas knew this was the defining moment. He could feel the energy humming beneath him, the silent question hanging in the air. Do we stop? Or do we show them what true greatness looks like? Thomas didn't need to pull the reins. He didn't need to force Storm into anything. He simply whispered, just like before. And Storm understood. The stallion pushed forward, faster than before, his muscles stretching to their fullest extent, his hooves barely seeming to touch the ground. The earth beneath them blurred into a streak of golden dust, the wind roared past them, and in that moment they became unstoppable. The roar of the wind and the rhythmic thunder of Storm's hooves filled the vast open plains, drowning out every doubt, every whispered mockery, every challenge that had been thrown at Thomas Whitaker. The chestnut thoroughbred moved like fire across the land, his muscles stretching to their fullest extent, his every motion a declaration of defiance against the expectations placed upon him. He had been called wild, untrainable, but now he was proving them all wrong. Thomas felt the raw power beneath him, the steady, explosive rhythm of Storm's strides blending with the pulse pounding in his chest. He had spent decades working with horses, but this was different. This wasn't just about riding, about taming. This was something rare, something that few men ever got to experience. Trust. Absolute, unshaken trust between man and beast. Behind them, the ranch hands stood in eerie silence, their bodies stiff, their expressions locked in wide-eyed disbelief. Not a single one of them dared to speak. The only sound came from the wind howling through the dry fields, carrying the dust kicked up by Storm's relentless gallop. The very men who had ridiculed Thomas just moments ago were now watching history unfold. Frank Dawson, however, was not silent. His boots stomped across the dirt as he marched forward, his face twisted in a storm of emotions: anger, frustration, and something else buried deep beneath the surface: fear. He had built his reputation on being the man who controlled everything: his land, his horses, and the men who worked for him. But control was slipping from his grasp like water through his fingers, and he knew it. Enough of this nonsense. Dawson's voice snapped through the air like a whip, but there was no power behind it. The men around him didn't laugh this time. They didn't sneer. They simply stared at the scene before them, their loyalty to Dawson wavering, their admiration shifting toward the man on the horse. Thomas heard Dawson, but he didn't acknowledge him. He had no need to. His focus remained on Storm, on the way the stallion responded to every subtle movement of his hands, his legs, his presence. There was no battle between them, no fight for dominance. There was only understanding. But even as they moved as one, Thomas felt something deep in his bones. Storm wasn't done yet. The stallion had spent too long being underestimated, too long being forced into a mold that had never fit him. And now he had something to prove. Then, without warning, Storm pushed harder. His stride stretched impossibly further, his hooves dug deep into the earth, and suddenly, he wasn't just running. He was flying. The landscape blurred around them, the world falling away as Storm reached speeds no one had ever dared to push him toward before. It was raw, untamed freedom. And for the first time in his life, Thomas let go of every last doubt he had ever held. The ranch had never witnessed anything like it. Storm was no longer just running, he was soaring. His long, muscular legs devoured the ground beneath him, his chestnut coat gleaming under the fading light of dusk. The wind howled past them, carrying with it the dust Storm's hooves kicked up with every powerful stride. He was untouchable, a force of nature. Thomas Whitaker felt every ounce of that power beneath him, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the horse. It was as if time itself had slowed, leaving only the thunderous beat of Storm's gallop and the deep, steady breaths of the stallion beneath him. He had never felt a connection like this before. It wasn't just about riding, it was about becoming one with the animal, understanding his heartbeat, his instincts, his very soul. The men watching were frozen, their expressions shifting from doubt to something else entirely. Awe. They had spent months watching Storm fight, watching him throw every rider who dared climb onto his back. But now, before their very eyes, he wasn't just obeying. He was thriving. He wasn't running out of fear, wasn't trying to escape. He was running because he wanted to. Because he had finally found someone worth running with. And Frank Dawson knew it. The ranch owner's fists were clenched, his jaw locked so tight it looked as if his teeth might shatter. He had mocked Thomas, ridiculed him, dismissed him as an old fool stuck in the past. But now, that same man, that relic of a bygone era, was proving him wrong in the most undeniable way possible. And what made it worse? His own men were starting to see it too. That horse is reckless. Dawson barked, his voice dripping with frustration. He's out of control. But no one responded. Not a single man standing beside him echoed his words. Because they all knew the truth. Storm wasn't reckless. He wasn't out of control. He had finally found control on his own terms. And then, as if sensing the final moment that would silence every doubt, Thomas did something no one expected. He loosened his grip on the reins. It was a gesture of trust so profound, so absolute, that the ranch hands gasped audibly. No rider, in all the months Storm had been on this ranch, had ever dared to do such a thing. No one had ever believed in him enough to try. But Thomas did. Storm didn't falter. He didn't buck, didn't veer off course. He kept running, faster, stronger, freer than ever before. And in that instant, everyone watching knew, this wasn't a battle of dominance anymore. It never had been. It was a lesson. One that Frank Dawson would never forget. The wind screamed past them, but Storm didn't slow down. If anything, he pushed harder, his hooves hammering the earth in a rhythm so precise it felt orchestrated by fate itself. The muscles in his legs stretched to their full power, his mane whipped wildly behind him, catching the last light of the sun. He was no longer just running, he was proving something. Proving that no one had ever truly understood him. That every man who had tried to force him into submission had failed because they had never taken the time to listen. And Thomas had listened. For a fleeting moment, Thomas allowed himself to close his eyes, feeling the sheer force of Storm's gallop beneath him. This wasn't about breaking a horse. This was about trust, respect, and understanding. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat was in sync now. Thomas wasn't riding Storm. He was running with him. And the stallion, in return, wasn't carrying a burden. He was carrying a partner. Back at the ranch, the men could do nothing but watch, their faces frozen in disbelief. Even the most hardened among them, men who had spent their lives around horses, who had seen and ridden the best, had never witnessed anything like this. The old man they had mocked, dismissed as relic of a forgotten era, had done the impossible. He hadn't broken Storm. He had earned him. But no one felt the weight of this moment more than Frank Dawson. His breath was shallow, his pulse hammering against his skull. His entire world, his reputation, his authority, his legacy, was crumbling right in front of him. He had placed his bets on brute force, on control through fear, on bending nature to his will. And now he was watching his greatest failure unfold in the most humiliating way possible. Thomas had succeeded where he had failed. Dawson's face twisted in rage, his voice breaking the silence. "Enough!" he roared. "That's enough! Bring that damn horse back here!" But his command carried no weight anymore. His men no longer moved at his orders. They were no longer looking at Dawson. Their eyes were locked on Thomas and Storm, on the future, on the undeniable truth that no amount of shouting could erase. And then, as if making the final undeniable statement, Storm did something that no one could have predicted. Instead of slowing, instead of stopping, the stallion did the unthinkable. He reared up, his front hooves slicing through the air like a king claiming his throne. And in that moment, every man watching knew, Storm had chosen his rider. Storm's hooves came crashing down, sending a shockwave of dust into the air, marking the end of his declaration. The entire ranch stood frozen, the air thick with something more powerful than disbelief, understanding. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Because in that single moment, every man there knew the truth. Storm had chosen Thomas Whitaker. And Frank Dawson knew it too. His hands trembled at his sides, his face drained of color. He had spent months trying to control this horse, to bend him to his will, to force him into submission. But all along, it had never been about power. It had never been about strength or dominance. It had been about trust. And Thomas, the man he had ridiculed, the man he had dismissed as outdated, had earned that trust without ever raising a whip, without ever demanding obedience. The ranch hands, once loyal to Dawson's every word, now exchanged glances among themselves. Their loyalty was shifting. They weren't just watching a horse being tamed. They were witnessing a lesson, a truth that shattered everything they thought they knew. Thomas sat still in the saddle, his hands steady on the reins. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply reached forward, running a rough but gentle hand down Storm's powerful neck, letting the stallion feel the same reassurance he had felt from him. It wasn't victory. It was respect. For a long moment, Dawson said nothing. He looked around, searching for someone to back him up, to validate his authority. But the looks he received in return were not of fear, not of obedience, but of quiet judgment. His men had seen what he refused to see. He had lost. And not just the bet, he had lost their respect. Finally, with a bitter exhale, Dawson pulled his hat lower over his eyes and turned away. He didn't say another word. He just walked off, his boots kicking up dust, his pride left in ruins behind him. One by one, the ranch hands stepped forward. First in curiosity, then in admiration, and then something no one expected happened. One of them, a man who had once mocked Thomas the loudest, removed his hat and nodded. A gesture of respect. Then another, and another, until, at last, every man on the ranch stood in silent acknowledgement of the truth that had unfolded before them. Thomas Whitaker had not only tamed the untamable, he had changed everything.